live
There
from
you
the Greendale studios.
go.
It says it's setting up the meeting.
Okay. There you go. It says live. Oh, it says live streaming on Facebook.
Well, then I guess we're live streaming
Must be
on
live.
Facebook. Hi, everybody. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. We're here to do our weekly book read. We're moving along in the chapters of Beyond Resistance by John Dorhauer, Pastor John Dorhauer. Tonight we're going to be reading chapter 9. So I'm glad you're here, and you don't have to have the book to listen in. We'll do all the reading for you. I just want to hit the record button too, just to back this up.
Good idea.
Yeah, let's see, record on this computer, and we're recording.
There we
All
go.
right, chapter 9, The Mount. There are many paths leading to the top of Mount Fuji, but there is only one summit, love. And that is by Morihei Ueshiba. When I called Chad Whitehead to arrange to interview him, he recommended we meet at the Red Rock Brewery in Salt Lake City. I asked him how I would recognize him, and he said, "I'm a tall 30-something hipster." I laughed, said, "Perfect," and then hung up the phone, realizing I had no idea what a hipster looked like. Tall, I could figure out. I assumed I could fake the rest. I arrived a little early to our meeting. I was driving down from Boise, Idaho, where I had spent the previous day watching a high school baseball tournament. The day before, I left a cabin outside of Rainier, where I had spent a week with 2 bikes and a case or so of baked beans. I was glad to have gotten to the brewery early and just relaxed before Chad arrived. I was seated at an indoor table looking across the Salt Lake Valley to the mountains just east of the city when I saw a very tall, very slender hipster walk across the parking lot. Without knowing anything at all about being hip, I knew when I saw him, he defined the term. He was, in a word, cool. He dressed in that way that cool people do. I can't describe it at all. I don't have whatever gene one has that affords them the opportunity to choose just the right clothes and assemble them on their frame in a way that makes people want to just look like that. His hair lay perfectly above his handsome face. He exuded both confidence and affability. We made eye contact, and his smile told me instantly he knew who I was. His arm extended to me, and we shared a firm and friendly handshake. The conversation that followed passed between us with the ease of 2 people who, without having ever met, felt like they shared something already that bound them together. Chad leads a postmodern community of faith in Mormon-dominated Salt Lake City called The Mount. He is, in some ways, a disciple of Mark Scandretti, founder of Reimagine in San Francisco. He says this with a sense of pride born of both an admiration of a mentor he would like to emulate and an incredulity that the mentor is there to support and guide him. He was referred by Mark by a friend of a friend who, on a mission trip in which both were on a search for social justice, told him to quite simply find Mark. Chad Googled Mark, learning what he could about him, enough to know that this was an important leader in the emergent movement. He went out to San Francisco to meet with him and arranged for Mark to be a spiritual director on a retreat held for the members of the Mount. The Mount was formed back in 2006. Unlike many postmodern communities, this one was birthed by and has its costs covered by an existing institutional church. Chad described himself at that time as a dispassionate, despondent youth pastor in Salt Lake City who casually began attending the Mount in 2008. Within a month, they had roped him in as a very part-time volunteer coordinator. As a new church was started by an existing church, the Mount is a different model for how emergent postmodern communities can form. There are always questions with this model: how much latitude the planted church has to break new ground and to report using metrics that prove worth to the institutional church. What is remarkable about the Mount is that Chad truly believes that even though he is funded in his ministry by the existing church, he does not feel any restrictions placed on him to build a postmodern community. In some ways, that makes this particular example of an emergent community so very interesting. The Mount was the vision of a senior pastor who wanted to plant a church for a whole new demographic. They provide a full-time staff person and also maintain their website for them. Before he started serving the Mount, Chad arrived at the parent church, Mount Olympus Presbyterian in Salt Lake City, to serve as youth minister. In that time, he grew a lot. He read what Jesus had to say, and he asked a lot of questions, some of them about mission, some about money and its uses and abuses, some about lifestyle choices. He began to question whether or not his own life sufficiently demonstrated an awareness of and commitment to what Jesus taught. Too many voices in the mainstream church responded to these deep, honest, and abiding questions with a sense of dismissal or minimization. Many would tell Chad that we live in a different context. The circumstances are different for us, and the culture of Jesus' time influenced what Jesus said. There was no one to talk to about his questions regarding the use of money, about his concerns about the environment, or about politics. It was just expected that in Salt Lake City, you were a Republican. The radio playing in the church office had Rush Limbaugh queued up every day. Chad's wife, though, began attending the Mount. It would be she who would get him to shift gears a bit and look for the sacred in a new place. For Chad, the difference was like night and day. He felt it was so refreshing to be engaged in his faith life where open discussions could take place. The Mount came as a balm to this bitter and tired youth minister. He now serves as their spiritual leader. When Chad talks about the worship practices of the Mount, he begins by saying, "We're not very clever." What he means is that there is a raw simplicity to the shared worship life of the community. For about 20 minutes, there is what he describes as young adult style worship. That's followed by an intermission. Then there is a time for a teaching moment, all within the sanctuary of Mount Olympus Presbyterian Church. At the time of my interview with him, Chad reported that they had just started doing communion. This introduced some new tension into the group. There were those who were there because they had walked away from the church, and this felt either unsafe to them or like too much of a reminder of what it was they left. Chad notes that he feels in these moments that he is an in-between guy. I find that to be a beautiful expression, if not a mission statement. It is clear that there are times when these communities feel conflicted about what stays and what goes. Every community I visited with has different ways of dealing with these matters: the Bible, baptism, communion, etc. To some, it feels like the old, stale, painful way of being church they left behind, while to others, it is less about a call to abandon the old as it is a challenge to repurpose the old and infuse it with new meaning. Chad finds real value in being connected to an existing congregation. He says there is strength in that connection. Having said that, he is quick to point out that he and his members see no value in identifying as Presbyterian. There have been mentors from the existing church who have had very meaningful relationships with some of the postmoderns that Chad leads, but the end game will no longer include accruing members who identify with a denomination. Chad points out that the Mount is not looking for any kind of independence right now. The Mount is exactly what the senior pastor envisioned it would be when it was birthed, serving a different demographic. The Mount is a bunch of young people. They want to engage in mission, but they don't have the will, desire, or capacity to tithe. The ongoing support for this emergent postmodern community will, at least for the foreseeable future, come from a strong, healthy, and vital Church 2.0. For now, because they use the sanctuary of the existing congregation, the gathered sit in pews. It's a simple setting, nothing fancy, some wood, some stone. People begin walking in around 6 p.m. They grab some coffee. For a while, they started even later than that, but then those with children felt that they couldn't finish early enough to get home with the kids and complete their bedtime rituals. So they start their service earlier in the evening. This in itself is a very postmodern reality. Many institutional churches still worship at the hour established when the farmers could get free after doing morning chores, getting breakfast, cleaning up, and getting to the church, namely around 10 or 10:30. It would take something just short of an act of God to change that time. Postmodern communities live with a flexibility that allows them to talk about how needs can be met. Decisions are made but never established as normative. They are always negotiable. The worship has a very still, almost contemplative feel to it. There is also time for interactive participation, one of the hallmarks of postmodern experience. Chad does do some preaching, usually after an intermission. The night ends with a prayer together. There is a band that plays, but as Chad said earlier, none of that rock and roll shit. There are no members. There is no functioning concept of membership. They have not exactly figured out how to navigate that yet. There is no interest in identifying anyone as or electing anyone to the role of president. There is no mission statement. During the school year, there could be as many as 80 there. During the summer, close to 50. The preaching Chad does is something he identifies as postmodern preaching. It is not some white guy telling the world what will be. Other voices are always involved in the preaching process. Sometimes the entire group gets involved. He will often ask for volunteers to blog about the upcoming text during the week. He is often blown away by how articulate they are and can be. Chad points out that this group is not just different. He says we are called to be different. That is a powerful distinction for him. It is an interesting articulation of a postmodern mandate. There is clearly something different going on here. That is not just an accident of circumstance. There is an intentionality to it that is seen as legitimate response to the impulse of the Holy Spirit. There is a sense of call in this. Recreate my church. Speak the gospel to a new time and a new people who hear with new ears and see with new eyes. The former things have passed away. Do you not perceive it? As Chad says, we own this. If you want something more traditional, go find it. You have options. He points out that this is not This is not just non-traditional Christianity. This is an intentional recreation intended to meet the needs of those whose search for the sacred and divine is not being met by the current model of the church. There is imperative here born of a desire to keep the gospel alive. Chad's first words after reflecting on this were, "We don't know everything." Those are the words of a committed postmodern. We don't know everything. We are going to live out our calling faithfully and passionately and unapologetically, but we don't know it all. We don't need to. If Jesus is true, Chad asks, then how are we called to live? And why don't we? For this postmodern, these are the questions that have always been on the table. This new way of being the church is an invitation to an authentic and shared exploration of what might be possible if we take those questions to heart. Excuse me. The Mount is the coming together of a community deeply committed to learning who Jesus was and what that means for us this day. Conversations are the points along the way that get marked. Time is spent learning to be good listeners. This is a critical growing edge for all of them. In addition to the Sunday evening gathering, the midweek options vary. Chad teaches that modern people need to sit quietly. They schedule contemplative sits. They do hikes where they walk for 20 minutes, then sit. They hike some more, then they sit. These are baby steps, he says, but there is an audience building for this. At the time of the interview, the Mount had just completed a Tuesday evening Bible study. It was what Chad called a hybrid traditional study, modified by Mark Scandretti's practice-based study. Every participant was invited to do something based on what they hear in the text, and then everyone returns to talk about their experience. For this study, they looked at Jonah and Ruth together. The theme, loosely, was God's mercy for the non-chosen. One participant noted that Ruth had to scrounge for food, and so she challenged herself to go do that. Someone else noted the theme in the narrative about playing favorites and decided to focus attention on prejudice. They organized an art show in which the theme of the art was to portray a time when you showed prejudice to another. Another participant wrote a poem about their resentment of Mormons. Someone else wrote a children's story about helping a young child with autism. They did that because they were working to overcome their own fear of those who are diagnosed as autistic. This combination of traditional studying the text combined with an action that follows, and then processing the experience of the action is a type of learning that many are getting into. There have been, Chad notes, some who just outright reject this method, though, and who want to just sit around and talk about the text. When this group took over the gather, Chad tells, only 5 people kept coming. They would sit for 2 hours and talk. Everyone else stopped seeing the value in it. When Mark Scandretti released a new book on simplicity, the Mount invited him to come and lead a retreat for them. The purpose of the retreat will be not only to focus on simplicity as a modality for living the way of Jesus, but also to create a new vision of these practice-based groups. There is a buzz of excitement at the Mount about this possibility. Although at this point, there is not a single focus as a group on a collective mission, the individual participants commit in various ways to making a difference. There are some who volunteer to support an after-school program. One member mentors Mormon women who have been sexually abused. One works at a local refuge for abused women. Another works at the farmer's market sorting garbage. When I asked Chad what his metric was, how did he judge whether they were succeeding, He said pretty quickly, it isn't members and it isn't money. He said they just can't do that. The folk who come don't give anything, and he doesn't always ask. If it were about that, he says that without a doubt, they would be shut down. The funding comes from the existing church, and they do it because they see young people and families showing up. I asked if this was supposed to be a feeder church for the existing church that funds them. He said originally that was the plan. Now, though, he says that most are beginning to think this postmodern thing isn't a fad, it's here to stay. When I asked if he had any allies in Salt Lake, he said he did, but that they don't agree with each other. There is an appreciation for what he is doing, but also a deep lack of understanding about how he does it. Chad says that if there is one thing that he would like people to know about the Mount, it would be that we are a safe place. There is no theology of division he can find in the teachings of Jesus. That feels like a good place to stop. The Mount, a sacred community inhabiting someone else's sanctuary in the heart of Mormon-dominated Salt Lake City, providing safe space to all. They are the balm for the bitter and the tired. And so concludes chapter 9.
It's kind of interesting, the part about the action-oriented part of taking the biblical text and not interpretation, but running with whatever theme the person applies in their life, and then
Right.
returning to report on it. I thought that was kind of interesting. I think there are times that, I love Rev Kev's sermons, but there are times you get by the end of the week and has it been an opportunity to reflect on, is it still with you by the time you get to the end of the week?
Mhm.
And maybe
Yeah.
the question is, is there something to an assignment or something that appeals to you to, guide your own spirituality individually of, wow, I really want to research that biblical text a little bit more and see what I can do with it until the next
Yeah.
reading. So just very interesting. That was an interesting thought.
I found it very interesting too. I think that the activity of carrying out the gospel in some way is what we've been saying all along, that we're here to reach out to the community, not to be like a country club unto ourselves.
Right.
There are just so many needs for these different types of things. I love the correlation of the Church 2.0 starting at 9, 10, 10:30 because of the farmers. And when you think about it,
Yeah.
So in our context, we've heard the blame game going on. Well, it's Sunday morning sports that's ruined it and blah, 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 blah. And it's really not. It's an entire shift in society that has made this time not so sacred. And really, it's the sacredness is in doing the work and not so much watching the clock or watching the bank book for that matter.
Right. I thought the other interesting piece was when he referred to the mission as we're in between.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that too. So we wonder about what our mission is to carry out. And when you think about the mission that the Mount is carrying out for Mount Olympus Church itself, it's reaching out to those people.
Right.
So therein comes the question, we can't totally abandon 2.0 from the sound of it, because somehow this type of ministry has to be funded, and the recognition has to be made that the ministry is going to require action. It's not just sitting back, listening to a sermon, listening to a couple of text readings from the Bible, and then going out into the week and not doing anything about it. Like you said, it's got to carry meaning. So to reach the group of people that need to be ministered is exactly what we need to be charging to do. And we have to exceed that comfort level of they've got to come to us. No, we have to go to them. What I also found interesting about the book is that it points to how this is an evolution and that there are so many unanswered questions.
Sure.
They don't have a clearly defined mission, but obviously there's mission work being done here because they've got the after-school program. They've modified the timing so that it meets the needs of the people that they're called to serve.
Right.
So, yeah, right.
I
I'm
thought
liking
the
it.
other, yeah, I thought the other interesting piece was we talk about two or more are gathered in his name, and they're talking about 50 or even 80 people. You know, that's a lot of people that are gathering for the word.
You bet. Coming
so-
in on a summer night of all times,
Right.
when people are going away during the summer months, they're getting people coming in the middle of the week that are increasing rather than during the program year when they're at lower counts, lower head counts. So, yeah, that is pretty interesting. It's kind of
And then
flipped.
the other piece was the being the feeder to the feeder church, and that was their original intent, and then it's turning into something. It's evolving into something else.
Yep, yep. it
That's
is.
just, it's all very interesting.
So the funding is there, and he talked about how the Source Church has to have the funding to be able to do this, to be able to support that kind of work. So I think that it really should give us pause to question, what are we really doing with our money, type of thing.
Right.
Mm,
Absolutely. Is it the building?
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's it, guys.
Here you
For
go. So next week is chapter 10,
it
the
is
emergent desert.
the emergent. Oh, that's interesting.
The emergent desert.
Wow. And then after that, it looks like there's just one more chapter, huh? 11.
Almost done, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll be here for 2 more weeks discussing this one. And who knows what we'll be reading next. But thanks you all for joining us. And Kim,
Yep.
as
you
usual,
go.
thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
And we'll say good night for now and hope you all have a nice 4th of July weekend.
Absolutely. Happy Independence Day.
Amen. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.